Arthur Pembroke here with Nightmare Theatre. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. Tonight's tale is sure to chill you to your bones. It is an original story inspired by an English nursery rhyme first published in 1842. The first telling of the poem, however, goes back even further. Take a seat by the fireplace and let me tell you about the Crooked Man. Once there was a crooked man who walked a crooked mile. He found a crooked sixpence upon a crooked stile. He bought a crooked cat which caught a crooked mouse, and they all lived together in a little crooked house. I was 7 years old when I first saw him. It was late, past midnight, and I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling. My nightlight flickered softly from across the room, casting long shadows that danced against the walls. I remember the air felt thick, heavier than usual, and the silence of the house was almost suffocating. The only sound was the occasional creak of the old wood as the house settled. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping. At first I thought it was the wind, or maybe something brushing against the window outside. But the tapping was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It came from the direction of my closet. My heart began to pound in my chest as I stared at the wooden door, barely visible in the dim light. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up slowly, pulling the blanket up to my chin. I didn't want to get out of bed, but I also couldn't just sit there and wait. I had to check, I had to know. I slid my feet onto the cold hardwood floor, wincing at the chill, and slowly made my way toward the closet door. The tapping stopped as soon as I reached for the handle. For a moment, I just stood there, my hand hovering in the air, heart racing. The silence was deafening. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to go back to bed, to hide under the covers and pretend nothing was wrong. But I couldn't. I had to look. With trembling fingers, I opened the door. It was empty. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a strange mixture of relief and embarrassment. Of course, there was nothing there. Just my clothes, some toys, and the usual mess. But as I started to close the door, something caught my eye. Something in the far corner, barely visible behind my hanging clothes. A figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs that stretched awkwardly as it stood hunched over. The thing was dressed in a black suit, its clothes too small for its twisted frame. Its face was pale, unnaturally white, with deep, hollow eyes, and a grin that stretched from ear to ear, too wide, too crooked. I gasped, stumbling backward, and the door slammed shut on its own, leaving me in the dark, alone. I crawled back into bed, heart hammering in my chest, pulling the blankets over my head. I wanted to scream, to run to my parents, but I was frozen with fear. For what felt like hours, I lay there, shaking, listening for any sound. But the house was quiet again, eerily quiet. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I convinced myself it had all been a nightmare. I tried to brush it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew what I'd seen was real. Still, I said nothing to my parents. I didn't want them to think I was crazy, or worse, that I was lying. But the next night, it happened again. This time I didn't hear the tapping. Instead, I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the floor, like nails dragging across the wood. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. The noise was coming from under my bed. I held my breath, too terrified to move. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, getting closer and closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to stay still, to be quiet. But the sound was relentless. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. I opened my eyes just a sliver, peeking out from under the blanket, and there he was. The Crooked Man. He was standing at the foot of my bed, his impossibly long fingers resting on the mattress, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. His grin was wider now, stretching even further across his face, and his eyes, Those hollow, black eyes stared straight at me, unblinking, as if he was waiting for something. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed, my body refusing to move as he leaned closer, his twisted body bending at impossible angles. His breath was cold, smelling of decay and something foul like rotting meat. He was so close now that I could see every detail of his gaunt, misshapen face. Then, in a voice that was soft and raspy, he whispered, "I found you." I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew it was morning and the sunlight was streaming through the window. My parents didn't notice anything strange when I told them I wasn't feeling well, but I knew I couldn't stay in that room anymore. I begged them to let me sleep with them, or at least leave the light on, but they just smiled and told me not to worry. Over the next few nights, the visits became more frequent. The crooked man would appear in different places, sometimes at the foot of my bed, other times in the corner of the room, always watching, always grinning. His presence was suffocating, the air around him cold and thick, like he was draining the life from the room itself. I stopped sleeping altogether, too afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes. But even when I was awake, I could feel him, always lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when I was weakest. One night, after days of sleeplessness and terror, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront him. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I believed that if I faced him, he would go away. So when I heard the familiar scraping sound under my bed that night, I didn't hide. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, heart pounding in my chest, and looked. He was there, crouched under the bed, his long, bony fingers wrapped around the bed frame. His face, twisted and grotesque, grinned up at me wider than ever before. "Come with me," he whispered, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. And in that moment I realized something. The crooked man didn't just want to scare me, he wanted to take me. He wanted to drag me into whatever nightmare world he came from, to twist and break me, just like him. I screamed, finally finding my voice, and bolted for the door. My parents came running, but by the time they got to my room, the crooked man was gone. I tried to explain what I had seen, but they just looked at me with concern, like I was losing my mind. We moved not long after that. My parents thought a change of scenery would help, that maybe getting away from the old house would stop the nightmares. But even now, years later, I can still feel him. Sometimes in the dead of night, I wake up and swear I can hear that soft tapping sound, like he's still looking for me. And I know one day he'll find me again, because the crooked man never really leaves. He's just waiting patiently for the moment when you least expect it. And when he finds you, there's no escape. Thank you, as always, for joining me. I really appreciate you reaching the end of my story. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. This tale was a listener request. If you have other ideas for stories you'd like to hear, let me know. Have a good night and make sure to check your closet for the crooked man before you drift off to sleep tonight.